Well, here's where things go wrong with the respiratory system. Tuberculosis, or TB, is caused by these tiny bacteria known as mycobacteria, spread primarily through respiration droplets. We inhale these, lesions form in our lungs, and then the infection moves to the apical, or the top part of the lungs, and that's why we listen to many different places to the lungs, and they might move into the kidneys as well. It's going to destroy patches of lung tissue, so you don't get this overall destruction. You get just sections of the alveoli. And then it'll move into the lymphatic system, and even the spine, the kidneys, the brain, and can become fatal. We can diagnose this with x-rays and sputum samples where the patient coughs and that liquid is smeared onto a slide. Bronchitis is familiar, but that doesn't mean we should be comfortable with it. It's an irritation of the ciliated epithelia. Now we have these tiny hairs that sweep endlessly to keep our lungs clear. But as they become irritated and the mucus starts to build up, we have inflammation. Now it's not always caused by bacteria, although excessive mucus can create a habitat for bacteria. But air pollution, smoking, allergies can all contribute to bronchitis. Over time, we get scarring of the inner lining, and then gradually that airway becomes constricted. Bronchiolitis, you may not hear about this much, but it's often an advanced stage of bronchitis. The enzymes that are produced by bacteria are gradually going to dissolve the alveoli. Now, if you remember, alveoli are those microscopic grape-like clusters that the lungs are full of. But as these alveoli break apart, they're replaced with this inelastic fibrous tissue, and pretty soon we're on oxygen. We have to have a nasal cannula and wheel our oxygen tank around where we go. So you don't have to smoke to destroy your lungs. Cyanosis is a symptom when there are low levels of oxygen. The lips, the fingernails, beds often turn bluish, and truly can look bluish. As one RT told me, once you see cyanosis, you never forget it. COPD is a chronic obstructive condition of the pulmonary system. It can be caused by many diseases, some that don't seem fair. For example, asthma, but bronchitis, emphysema. We often think COPD and smoking, and that is truly the most common matchup. In COPD, at least some types of COPD, tolerance develops to hypoxic or hypoxia. Now, if you remember, hypoxia is low levels of oxygen in the tissues of the body. So, in the case of something like emphysema, the hypoxic drive takes over. Now, to understand this, let's review what normally happens. When carbon dioxide, CO2, builds up in our bloodstream, then our pH drops, it becomes acidic, and that tells our brain, hey, tell the diaphragm to breathe. We've got to breathe. But when you have hypoxia or hypoxic drive, breathing is triggered by low levels of oxygen. Okay, so you got to get that straight. There's a difference, because think about this. You have someone with the hypoxic drive, and you're treating them with oxygen, which is often the standard treatment for someone with COPD. And so oxygen perfusing their bloodstream, and all of a sudden they have enough oxygen, so their body says, hey, yeah, we got the oxygen, and they forget to breathe. Now, it's not this simple, but you can see the situation there, the hypoxic drive. Asthma is a type of COPD, although thankfully they don't have the hypoxic drive. It's often due to IgE antibodies. Now, these are proteins on our own bloodstream that are there to protect us, but sometimes they flag these allergens, which are really harmless. Things like pollen, smoke, other types of pollutants. So once they're flagged, then we have things called chemicals called cytokines and histamines, and their job is to cause an inflammatory response It's like a defensive mechanism. You're saying, hey, we're under attack. And so lots of fluids flow into those tissues, but unfortunately, we're not being attacked. It's just a harmless allergen. The capillaries will leak fluids, and if you look at the diagram, the walls of those bronchioles will swell, and now the lumen is constricted. Often there's a sound on the exhalation, wheezing, leading cause of chronic illness in children. And it's just getting worse as our air quality degrades. I mentioned it doesn't give the hypoxic drive, thankfully. And yeah, one of the symptoms is that wheezing on the expiration. Influenza, we often just call it the flu. And we have to get a flu shot every year. Now, there's a lot of debate about this, but really there doesn't need to be. These are safe vaccines. And the reason we need them is that these viruses, they have an RNA instead of DNA. You and I, every night when we're sleeping, our DNA is repaired. But these flu viruses only have RNA. They don't have good repair mechanisms. So every year, got to have a new shot because there's new mutants cruising around out there. Streptococcus pneumoniae, often just called strep pneumonia, is in our upper airway. It's a resident. It's there. And if you ever get cold or weakened by a flu infection, then strep pneumonia starts to divide and spread into the lung tissues. And so we have a secondary infection. Now, if we'd just taken care of our cold or our flu in the first place, we wouldn't end up with something like this that may progress into pneumonia. So when you get that little sore throat, it's your streptococcus pneumonia talking to you. It's saying, hey, shake out of it, man. Have some good soup, get some rest. Quit being depressed. Forget that guy or girl that's messing with your head. Let's get back in the game. It's a positive feedback loop, so that means it's really a bad thing. There's no off switch. There's inflammation, and our body's going to respond to inflammation with excess mucus, and then that mucus creates a nice environment for these creepy streptococcus pneumoniae. Look it to the right. There they are. They're budding. They're in a nutritious fluid, and they just develop. Of course, that's microscopic, probably 1,000 magnified. But that is what we're dealing with. Lung cancer, carcinomas, there's various forms. So if you or a relative is diagnosed, then just pay attention. Because if it's small cell, which is the lung cancer that's most aggressive, then there's reason for some concern. Adenocarcinoma, which is most common, also called large cell, is fairly treatable in the early stages. Of course, the problem with any kind of cancer like this is the lungs perfuse gases all over the body, so the cancer doesn't stay put. We use a bronchoscope or some sort of PET scan or nuclear medicine to examine the bronchi for this disease. Histoplasmosis, you don't hear about this, but it's out there, and there's reason to be concerned if there's a bird droppings around, or especially if a bat gets loose in the house. That bat will fly around and urinate, and the urine turns into sort of an aerosol that people breathe. They don't mean to breathe it, and that's often how histo starts. So these fecal droppings, chickens or bats, and it's a fungus, and the symptoms at first are not, they're in the lungs, but then they'll move into the bloodstream, and interestingly, they move sometimes into the retina of the eye, and may eventually contribute to blindness. So if you see a bat flying around, especially if one gets loose in the house, leave and make a phone call to animal control and have them, they'll mask up and they'll take care of that problem for you. But don't you try to go chasing that bat around, or you might end up with histo.